The Beacon House Massacre. A crime too horrible for words. So horrible, in fact, that it fled the front pages as soon as the finer details began to trickle into the public sphere. Imagine how terrible a crime must be before the pack of vultures that dare call themselves the press in our day and age will quietly allow the sensational details of a socialite scandal to slip through their grasp. An act of mass murder so horrible that without fail every first responder to the crime scene had either left the emergency services entirely or been placed on leave. 38 people, one New Year's Eve celebration, one survivor, one killer. One killer who, in a derwish of blood and viscera, had stabbed and slashed and bludgeoned and burned his way through a room full of guests and catering staff. One killer found in the garden of his expensive Blue Mountains property with a steak knife, stabbed, hammered deep into his forehead. Self-inflicted. All the papers would dare mention was madness and carnage. Photos were hard enough to come by, but I'd heard it said that the editor of the Sydney Morning Herald had declined to furnish his front page with the one photograph of the Beacon House interior that his photographer had managed to capture. Instead, they played the human angle, a contrast to the savagery of the man who had brought so much misery into the world. Photos of the victims and their grieving families. Photos of the alleged killer lying unconscious in a hospital bed, his face half hidden by a thick layer of bandages. Malachi Durant had once been the darling of the Sydney architectural scene, heralded as the next Frank Lloyd Wright, praised by his contemporaries for his command of flow, space, and light. I must admit though, as a layperson, I had little understanding of what those terms meant in terms of architecture. I had been assigned by the state's attorney as a psychiatric expert to assess Malachi Durant's mental state before trial. Though the prosecutor did not believe the insanity defense Malachi's lawyers had put forward, for me, there was little doubt. Sane men did not butcher their friends and family on special occasions, and certainly not in the middle of the holiday season. The scar on Malachi Durant's forehead was minuscule in comparison to the injury. Just to the right of center, and only an inch above his eyebrow. His right eye, brown, glassy and unfocused, followed lazily behind the left one, blue as he focused on my entry into my office on Wednesday morning. From the doctor's report, I knew that in his madness he had jammed the steak knife deep into his skull and pounded it through the bone into his forebrain by bashing his head against the wall. Then, somehow still conscious, he had wriggled the blade to and fro until his right temporal lobe was nothing more than a mess of blood and fatty tissue. I sat down opposite Malachi Durant, mass murderer. "Good morning." A slight movement of his left eyelid, half hidden under a curtain of limp, once curly black hair, was all the sign Malachi gave that he understood me. "My name is Dr. Raymond Hunter, and..." I paused. I'd given this speech to dozens and dozens of patients, but the words felt stale in my mouth. The look in Malachi Durant's good eye demanded more than my usual fare. I dipped momentarily into honesty. "I'm here to assess your mental state before your trial, Mr. Durant, before returning to my usual speech. I'd also like to get to know you a little better. Malachi Durant gave a faint smile. Regret and sadness played across his expression as he watched me sit. I took my time, carefully considering tactics. Durant had been induced into a coma after the massacre, one which lasted for 2 months, about 6 weeks longer than it should have according to the doctors. And when he awoke, he had just screamed for days in spite of all attempts to both sedate and reason with him. I did not want to choose the wrong words and push him back into the darkness that he had somehow emerged from. I needed to get a feel for it, to understand its contours before I started taking any steps into unfamiliar terrain. "Where would you like to start?" I asked, giving him control.
The Muse. The Muse lied to me.
He said simply. "Your muse?" I asked. Malachi shook his head, looking out the window.
A muse. The muse of the house. The house was fake. She was fake.
I frowned. "You didn't like the house?" Malachi shook his head again, refusing to look at me.
No. The house was beautiful, but it was...
He swallowed hard, tears beginning to form.
The house, it was corrupt.
I paused and took a deep breath. Part of me wanted to rush onward with more questions, but I could see that Malachi was fragile enough as it was. I would temper my curiosity and take small steps for his sake.
She lied to me.
He turned to look at me. His right eye was twitching as he thought back the tears.
How can an angel lie? I don't understand.
He sobbed and slumped forward in his chair. It was a genuine question, a plea for help from a man lost in a storm-tossed sea. I started to recognize bits and pieces of the terrain in which Malachi Durant was lost. I nodded slowly and then spoke. "Malachi, I can see that you're quite upset, and I want to do everything I can to help you, but I need you to talk to me." Malachi looked up at me and took a deep breath, nodding slowly. I continued. "We won't open any doors you don't want to. We won't go down any path you don't want to. But I may need to ask you questions from time to time. But just remember, you decide what you want to answer. You're in control of how you get home. I'm just here to get you there." Malachi Durant smiled at me, and so help me God, I liked him. There was a kindness in those eyes, an innocence that belied the horrors that he had inflicted upon his fellow man.
Don't want to open the wrong door, right?
He laughed just once, bitterly. "Can you tell me about your muses?" I pluralized my question, taking an educated guess. Malachi nodded, straightening up.
I just thought I had a gift for understanding spaces, you know?
He smiled that regretful smile again.
I just called them muses, because that's what people do, right?
Another wave of pain broke across Malachi's face.
But not that house. That house was more than a usual creative inspiration. You know? It was...
He shuddered.
Doc?
I nodded. "What is it?"
What if you were doing something every day that filled you with joy? And what if you woke up one day to discover that you've been working for a nightmare?
He looked at me, his lower jaw trembling. "The angel?" I asked. "Did she make you do something bad?" Malachi shrugged.
I didn't think it was bad at the time.
I nodded sagely, recognition dawning. Did she ask you to hurt your friends? Malachi recoiled from me as though I had struck him, curling up into a ball on the chair opposite me.
No! It was the house, I swear! I built her a cage, and she made me watch her feed. I watch her eat them from the inside. They can't fool me again. Can't fool me again. Can't use me anymore. Can't do it. Won't do it. I won't do it. I won't do it. No, I won't do it.
Malachi gripped his knees tighter, holding himself while some inattention wound him up tighter and tighter. Malachi? I asked, my voice soft.
She ate them! She ate them!
He screamed at me, leaping from his chair to the coffee table. He landed precariously at its edge, and the table toppled out from under him as he leaned into me, face to face. I pushed myself away from this sudden advance, and we both fell, screaming. Myself calling for security, and Malachi screaming over and over.
It wasn't me! It wasn't me!
I pulled up the tab on the can of Coke, my hand still shaking, and put it to my lips. Adrenaline or not, I could have really done with something stronger in that moment. I closed my eyes, breathing deep and counting my breaths one at a time. When I reached 10, I finally felt a little more settled. I turned to the pile of reports and photographs on my desk. It was the stuff of nightmares, to be sure, but I steeled myself as I dug through the medical examiner's reports, looking for something that tracked of Malachi's rantings. Eaten them, he had said, from the inside. I spent more time on the text of the reports than on the photographs. I may have had years of medical training behind me, but the pictures of the massacre truly were of another nature entirely. Nowhere in the reports did I read anything about bite marks specifically, but there were a handful of details that struck me as odd. One report about an older gentleman mentioned his dermis and superior vena cava ruptured as though by sharp implement. Puckering on surface suggests exit wound. No corresponding entry on the back. Possible serrated blade? Would require exceptional force. I thought this part was odd enough in and of itself, but the ME had scrawled in later, no tool marks found on ribs on the wound site. Not so strange, I thought, if the blade had been pushed in horizontally. That wasn't the only odd note in the pile of autopsy reports. The next report related details of a fatal head injury. Wound is approximately 84 mm long and 3 mm wide. Lack of bone fragments around wound site suggests rotary cutting tool. Another note had been scrolled in between the lines. How the hell did he get them to stay still for all this carnage? And then continued. But no bone dust found around wound site. Did he clean it? I frowned, turning to the next report. Radius and ulna appear to have been removed with surgical precision before being stabbed into the ocular cavities of Miss Denning. See report 17 of this case file. Single cut from elbow to wrist with transverse cuts perpendicular to first. Wounding indicates extreme precision. 2 marks on bones suggest single cut with exceptionally sharp blade. Bruising and vascular constriction suggest pre-mortem injury. As noted in report 17, bones must have been cleaned prior to subsequent use. I thumbed through the pile to the report on Miss Denning. Both femurs shattered by blunt force trauma. Bruising around fracture sites indicate pointed impact with similar radius to adult male fist. Someone had added their own footnote, this time in red pen. Impossible. Before the report continued, lack of injury to Mr. Durant's hand precludes this explanation. COD ocular and cranial trauma due to wounding with forearm bones of Mr. Jackson. Absence of blood and tissue on bone exterior suggests cleaning with unknown agents prior to use. I shook my head. I could understand the state's attorney's reluctance to accept insanity as a defense. Certainly, Malachi Durant was crazy, but still coherent enough to perform a surgical excision and then clean the bones in a manner that left no traces. That did not at all look like the man who had been in my office but an hour beforehand. My mouth compressed to a thin line. I began to feel like I was being played for a fool. I took the afternoon off and drove out to the Blue Mountains, the setting for Malachi's first triumph as well as his downfall. The new wing of the Lithgow Art Gallery was 2 stories of gracefully curving brushed steel and glass, but more than its gentle shape, the gallery captured the afternoon sunlight and seemed to almost hold it, growing brighter even as the day finally gave way to night. The air inside seemed almost to tingle, and pillars of liquid gold would slide across the floor, their slow march highlighting one exhibit after another. Somehow Durant's genius had bent even sunlight to his will, causing the march of sunbeams to move at slightly different rates.
Admiring the Durant tour, are you?
I turned to the woman beside me. She was short and solidly built, her thick glasses catching bits and pieces of sunlight as she watched me watching the procession of sunbeams across the tiled floor. Duranto? I raised an eyebrow.
It's part of the design of the building.
She raised her arm, pointing to the slanting windows at the building's corner. I took note of the name tag pinned to her lapel. Sheila Green, curator. Between her long, almost white hair, the black clothes and crocheted shawl, and the thick silver necklace about her shoulders, she gave off the vibe of a kindly witch. I wondered if she had a cottage somewhere. I looked from Sheila to the windows and back again. How? Sheila smiled again.
Different materials in each pane. Some glass, some laxan, all different thicknesses. And a few others use nitrogen or argon, trapped between layers.
I nodded, high school physics rising up from the depths of my memory. Refractive indexes.
Indices.
Sheila corrected me reflexively. I craned my head, staring up at the windows, marveling at the secrets hidden in their apparent uniformity. Ingenious. It was a scene that stirred something that was both primal but also peaceful within me. For just a moment, I had the sense that I was viewing a mountain from the inside, all power and force trapped in state. The potential of stone waiting to be released, exploding into sculpture.
It makes you think, doesn't it?
Sheila's voice was like a bucket of ice to my reverie. But she had recognized the look on my face. Makes you feel, I corrected for her. Do you get a lot of artists coming here for the atmosphere? Sheila nodded, casting her gaze off the collection of sculptures on the pedestals beneath the sunbeams.
More than for the exhibits, actually.
She regarded me with her gaze once more.
But you're not an artist.
I nodded, sadly, suddenly regretful of the life choices that had taken me out of the path of Durant's sunbeams. I suppose not. I turned to her. But looking at this, it makes me want to create something. Sheila smiled.
You're not the only one. We're actually running classes on Saturdays.
She tilted her head at me, not sure what to make of the logical man, so obviously out of place here. I laughed a little nervously. Oh no, I'm definitely not an artist. Sheila shrugged.
But you can still feel it.
It?
The energy of the space here.
I stopped cold. I was a logical man. I believed and trusted in the evidence of my senses. I was grounded and rational. I believed in Occam's razor and the logic and order of the universe. But had I not been moved to the edge of a religious experience but a minute beforehand by the poetry in the refractive indices of various materials? Is that what it is? Sheila chuckled warmly.
We see more than we really understand, but we still want to find the words for it. We use what we're familiar with, I suppose.
She glanced over her shoulder at the gallery beyond. I opened my mouth, but only the sound of my breathing came out. Sheila Green was using my own material on me now. Energy and flow. Just nebulous, ill-defined terms for whatever it was about the geometry and aesthetics of the space that reacted with the human mind. Like the way many people can sense a door frame that isn't quite all right angles, or a picture frame on a wall that isn't quite square. Mr. Durant suddenly had a genius. Sheila nodded.
As the saying goes, genius and madness are two sides of the same coin.
I frowned. You think he's crazy? Sheila shook her head.
No.
So, what was Beacon House?
A mistake,
Sheila said, her words turning dark. I'd hardly call a massacre a mistake. Sheila shook her head.
Not the massacre. The house.
How do you mean?
Have you seen it?
I shook my head. I haven't. Sheila turned towards the stairs.
Wait here.
She began walking away. What for? I called after her.
You'll see.
I stared after the gallery's curator, long after she passed out of sight. Suddenly, I had a sense of something behind me. I turned to see the light through the panes had been stretched and was slowly changing color. No, I was seeing floodlights angled down through the windows at the roof's edge, emulating the sunbeams that had now started to touch the gallery's far wall. The other people in the room seemed to sense something as well. A man, maybe in his 30s, immediately turned for the exit, while a girl in her late teens passed through a beam at the gallery's far end and recoiled as though it had burned her. I could feel it too. The air in the room had taken a sinister turn, and even suffused with light, the room seemed to be hemorrhaging it at the same time, growing more and more dark with each passing second. I felt my heart rate rise in response to some unknown threat. And just as suddenly, the effect wore off, the lights cutting out. I turned towards the stairs, starting out after Sheila Green, curator. I was halfway down the curving staircase when she stepped out of a door marked Staff Only. She gave me a knowing look as she walked towards me. What was that?
I don't know. But we call it the anti-theft system, because nobody wants to be in the building when it's on.
Again, I found myself lost for words.
Mr. Durant's genius isn't perfect,
Sheila said.
as you can see.
And Beacon House? I got the sense that Sheila believed that it wasn't madness.
Is the other side of the coin.
I nodded, turning to leave. Thank you for the tour, I said. I got 3 steps away before Sheila's question stopped me in my tracks.
Do you wonder why none of them fought him? Why one man was never empowered by 38 others?
I stopped a moment. I'd assumed it was drugs,
Did you test for that?
Sheila asked. She'd seen through me. I may not have been with the police, but I was investigating, that was true enough. Even if I had the pile of autopsy reports in my office, I had never seen anything about tox screens. But then I hadn't been looking for the information, had I? I'll look into it, I said. Flow and space. They were the keys to understanding Malachi Durant's madness. Whatever it was in the gallery that produced that unsettling feeling when the floodlights had been turned on, was bound to have been present at Beacon House. Sheila, the gallery curator, had hinted as much. Malachi had a keen understanding of something visceral when it came to aesthetics, And perhaps that visceral understanding had, in the right light, pushed his genius over the edge into madness. Malachi Durant was a lot more subdued that morning, more guarded. He sat almost sideways on the couch, staring at the wall. "Good morning, Malachi." He did not respond, but his right eye twitched slightly in my direction. "I went to the Lithgow Art Gallery yesterday," I offered. Again, Malachi was silent. "You know, the sunbeams. They call it the Durant Tour. I've never seen anything like it before." I waited. Malachi was breathing harder now. He hugged his knees to his chest.
"It was so simple,"
he said, barely a whisper. "Physics," I said. Malachi nodded.
"But people never even think about it enough, you know? So they look up and it all looks the same and they think, magic."
I nodded, slowly. "It makes the world a little bit more fantastic."
Yeah, you're right.
Malachi began to uncoil a little. "Tell me about the floodlights," I asked.
Oh, on the gallery?
Malachi shrugged.
I was improvising the,
He paused, looking at me, nerves making his right eye twitch.
Muse said no, but I knew I could make it work.
"Tell me about the gallery muse, Malachi. How did it speak to you?"
Do you think it's important?
I nodded. "I do. I need to know as much as I can about your muses." Malachi frowned.
They're not mine. They just are. It's the feel of a place, you know? The pit of your gut.
Okay, I can accept that." Malachi leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, staring into space, remembering.
The original gallery building was this monstrous, ugly prison concrete thing that tried to look avant-garde, but it was basically just this concrete block. There's definitely logic and order on the insides, but the flow, the energy can't get around the place at all. It was despicable.
"So the muse asked you to fix it?" Malachi smiled at me.
As best I could, it showed me how. The gallery didn't want to move the car park, but the extension had to go on the northern side. They didn't want to render the old front hall on the inside either, or cut out doorways in the old wing, but the flow of the new wing had to be able to pass through this old wretched box that they had created in the first place.
I raised an eyebrow, like an eddy current in a river bend. Malachi sat upright, his eyes sparkling.
Yes, exactly, you're getting it, right?
I wrinkled my nose. "Not really. I understand what you did, but I don't really understand how or why it works." Malachi shrugged.
Well, same design wouldn't have worked in a different spot, even on the other side of the road even.
I frowned. "Why?"
Landscape.
Malachi said, as if that held all the clues.
Landscape. People think of it like an art, but there's a precision to it too. The flow on the other side of the road is all different. Different buildings, different lighting, it's all extremely subtle, but even the slightest difference of a few meters can throw the whole effect out the window. You get the picture, but it's only going to be fuzzy at best.
"You make it sound like the gallery is some kind of receiver." I chuckled softly at the thought, but the sudden intensity of Malachi's stare made me stop.
And now you know the truth,
he said. "Beacon House?" He nodded.
There's actually 3 levels to the house. The middle calls to the upper until you open to the doorway to the lower level. And that's how she got loose.
3 levels? I thought the house only had 2. Did you put in a basement or something? Malachi smiled at me, as though he were regarding a child.
The office is next to the master bedroom. Open the door from the master en-suite into the hall and then turn on the light in the office closet, and you'll see it.
A sudden thought occurred to me. "Malachi, did you build a secret room in Beacon House? Was there something in it?"
I guess I did. And there still is.
Malachi's smile didn't become any less paternal. I licked my lips. "What was it?" Malachi sighed.
You'll find out, Doc. You'll find out.
But we're...
Are we done now?
Malachi interrupted me, standing up.
Oh, I'm rather hungry.
I called the prosecutor and got permission to visit Beacon House. I was met at the front gate of the property by a uniformed officer in his early 40s. He shook my hand. "James Fenwick," he said, fishing a set of keys to the house from a pocket, and pressed the remote for the gate. I walked in, Officer Fenwick keeping strides with me. "Have you been inside before, Doc?" I shook my head. I'm supposed to be assessing Mr. Durant for trial, but he keeps shutting me down, making me jump through hoops. "Do you think he's crazy?" Fenwick was starting to huff and puff his way up the hill, struggling to keep pace with me. "I don't know what to think. On the one hand, he's emotionally unstable, deathly afraid of this place, and keeps rambling about being betrayed by angels," I said, looking at the large building ahead of us. The house was broad and low, with a weatherboard exterior. Warm, yellow paint on the exterior evoked the memory of sunlight, and the brilliant white trim of the windows gave another sense of light to the place. "And on the other?" I sighed. "On the other hand, he took apart 38 people with a precision that belies insanity and a bloodlust that absolutely screams psychosis." Fenwick nodded. "You're lucky they cleaned the place up. They got most of the blood, but they had to peel up the floor to get all of Maria Edgeworth and one of the caterers." I stopped. "Peel up the floor?" Officer Fenwick nodded again. "Burned them into it. Fuck knows how. Kinda looks like they were flash fried, but only on one side, and then melted into the floor, right down to the slab." He stepped onto the porch and thrust the key into the lock with a single graceful movement, before twisting the key and opening the door. "After you, Doc." I stepped into the house and was immediately struck by the space inside. It was the strangest house I had ever seen, let alone been inside. Ahead of me, a small, 3-sided vestibule opened up into a 7-sided room, just like the outside of the house, large enough to host a small concert. Several doorways led off to the sides, and even with the lights of the place, was bright. Up above the ceiling gave way to rooms which overlooked the internal space, and then soared on upward to a domed vault dotted with round windows, seemingly at random, before ending in sheets of glass at the very top. The very peak had to be 4 stories above me now. I whistled. "Yep, strange place." Officer Fenwick nodded at the strange roof. "Stranger still," he said, gesturing to the full-length sliding glass doors taking up 2 sides of the ground floor. "Why the hell nobody broke out of all the carnage? Wouldn't have taken much, even with the double glaze." I nodded, remembering Sheila Green's question from the day before. If everyone had been drugged, why hadn't the ME done a tox screen? I passed my gaze over the floor. Veins of fine black imperfection flowed steadily through polished white marble. Despite several missing pieces, there was a clear pattern in how the pieces had been laid, and the veins in the marble spiraled outward from a central point, forming 7 petals which overlapped each other. The effect was much more gaudy than the feeling of the gallery, but still no less impressive. The same color scheme from inside repeated gave the place an outdoor feel, but one which still managed to banish the winter chill beyond those gigantic sliding doors. "Is there a basement, you know?" I turned to Officer Fenwick to see him watching me. "Nope, don't think you could put anything underneath this place, not without it falling over." "Can you show me to the master bedroom?" Fenwick pointed to a door off to my left. "Middle door leads upstairs. Master bedroom is behind where you come up." I nodded my thanks, and Officer Fenwick excused himself, pulling a packet of cigarettes from a shirt pocket as he left the house. Any problems, give me a yell. When the door closed, I felt something strange. The history of the house, the sense of violence, disappeared almost instantly. Like the gallery, there was a sense of warmth, and the sunlight seemed to gather in even the darkest corners of the house. The illusion only faltered for a moment as I sidestepped a patch of missing tiles. I felt the warmth of the house twist, spying a few short strands of brown hair sticking out of solid concrete, as though it had been driven in with great force. I suppressed a shudder and opened the door, finding myself in a small den. Bookshelves lined each wall, and a television stood on the left-hand wall, a couch between myself and it. The staircase started in the corner immediately opposite the door and went straight up. Reaching the top, I found myself in the single hallway which circled the entire second story. To my left, the sky was beginning to turn pink and orange with the setting of the sun, and the lights of homes in the valley below Beacon House began to come on, declaring their existence among the trees for all to see. Outside, a balcony circled the entire house, but I declined to take a shortcut and backtrack, instead passing by all of the rooms on the upper level. The house was like a hotel, one central corridor backing onto rooms, a library, a gym, guest bedrooms, 1, 2, 3, a second staircase, a descent down which led me to a small room off the kitchen. I continued on, coming at last to the office and master en-suite and Malachi Durant's bedroom. The air up here was thick and heavy, and dust motes danced in the hazy light which came in from the outside. There was a window in Durant's office that overlooked the gallery floor. I flicked the light switch and rolled up the blind, peering down to the floor below, and I was struck by the pattern on the floor below. While the obvious pattern had been enforcing the organic pattern of cracks and imperfections in the marble to flow like graceful curves like the petals of a flower, there were cuts in other pieces of the marble too, which showed up in the afternoon light. Symbols and letters of unknown origin were formed by the hair-thin grouting between tiles. Lines where the flooring did not need lines, curved around the pattern of flower petals. And even with their missing pieces, the lettering filled me with a sense of calm and serenity, like that I had felt in the gallery. I frowned at this curious faculty of Durant's as I returned to the hallway to open the door to the master en-suite, and in the corner of the doorframe I caught sight of something odd. Flush with the level of the wooden door and scoured clean of the white paint that covered the rest of the door was a tiny circle of metal. I ran my finger over it. It lacked grooves of any kind, so it couldn't have been a screw. I checked the doorframe and found a circle of the same material, flush with the level of the first in the frame, and again in the doorway to the office. I checked the master bedroom door and found exactly the same scenario. So there was a ring of metal running at knee height through the entire upper floor. But why? Acting on a hunch, I licked my fingers and touched the two contacts in the bedroom doorway. Nothing. No tingle whatsoever. So if they didn't carry some kind of current, what were they for? But then I remembered the closet. I ran back to the office and opened the doorway into the office closet. The closet was a typical closet. Sturdy shelf lined the back half, and at the very top, just behind the light switch, nestled in the cornice above the doorway, was a small manhole, still covered. "Let's see what's in your secret room, Malachi," I smiled and flipped the switch. It was as though that one light switch kept the universe in being. I had a brief sensation of falling before a heavy shove in my chest pushed me back into the office. Light had fled, and the world outside had been reduced to black nothingness. The house was cast in monochrome light, into which a sickly blue-grey light filtered through sharp angles and cracks. I stood and peered through the office window and screamed. Below the angular symbols in the floor bled the same sickly blue-grey light, from which stepped figures made of nothingness. They moved through the room, standing at the edge of the marble floor, while heads made of nothingness stared at me with eyes unseen. I became aware of the sudden depth in the floor, seeing an infinite abyss falling away far below. I spied a straight wispy form flowing upward from the depths like a sea serpent. It passed through the flower in the center of the room, rising, a hideous serpentine form made from flesh of every color, many of them clearly inhuman. Crawling into being from the abyssal darkness far below, it flowed around the lines of force in the pattern, which now visibly crackled with power. Power turned dark by the pattern in the walls of a beacon house. As I watched the writhing of its flukes grasp and clutch at nothingness in the air around it, climbing higher and higher on empty air, reaching for the apex of the roof. And as it turned on me, I saw that the flukes which lined its body were arms, human and humanoid, crudely sewn to its body and weeping hideous black fluids and more of that blue-grey light. The body flared out at the head to end in a flat face covered in scales black as night, colored white by pain, which had the shape of a humanoid woman with wings of burning sunlight. It was the only point of warmth in the entire scene around me, and I clung to it, even as twin soulless eyes of deepest purple on either side fixed themselves on me. And as it reared back its head, I felt the monster drawing in its breath, pulling at my soul as it moved in to strike. I screamed even louder, helpless, wanting to get free but unable to move, fearful that if I broke gaze with the heavenly angel on that hideous face, I would never find my way back to the world of light that I had known. But at the very last second, I dove to the side as the beast lunged forward. I found myself in the office closet, the beast crashing through the window, showering me with glass. I reached up for the switch as the hideous face turned on me. I slapped the switch and was physically catapulted back to my simple little world, nearly hitting the ceiling and smashing back to the ground. Pain blossomed in my back, and I became aware of Officer Fenwick shouting to me, "Hunter! Hunter, where are you?" I gasped once, twice, and threw up. I screamed again and passed out. A hidden explosive. That's what they called it. The doctor said I was lucky to survive, given my proximity to the explosion that had torn apart the inner wall of Durant's office. Nobody questioned the lack of explosive residue, and despite taking my recommendation to take a look at the walls of Beacon House, the police reported no other evidence of explosives within the walls. The metal circles I had seen in the doorways had been passed off as simple reinforcing bars, being made out of thread bar as they were. Everything simple, everything neat and straightforward. I knew better, of course. Durant's muse. I had seen Durant's muse just as he had, in all her terrifying glory, decorated with the flesh of her victims, growing stronger and stronger with every kill. I called the state's attorney the next day and handed in my diagnosis: delusional psychosis. I pointed to the ample evidence in the murder, adding in a hatchet job of my own about symbols and the pseudo-occult nature of the house and its arrangements, as well as transcripts of my interviews with Durant. His ranting about being used by an angel and 3 levels of his 2-level house. The state's attorney wasn't happy with my diagnosis, but I didn't care. After what Malachi Durant had been through, he deserved to think himself insane. Maybe, given enough time, he would be able to see himself in that light, and forget the reality of what he had witnessed. For me, there was no such reprieve. I have to carry the truth with me. An open door and the light switch were the only thing standing between our world and hell. They tore down Beacon House the day after Malachi was declared mentally unfit. I watched it happen, and it brought me some small measure of peace. But I'm still fearful turning on any switch, anywhere, because I have no way of knowing if the angles are just right, if the flow of light and space is perfect, if the signal is perfect to turn on another beacon.